Little girl opens the gate for a stray pit bull. It charges with teeth bared, but what happens next? Emma's backyard in Austin, Texas, wasn't much, just a patch of dying grass surrounded by a weathered wooden fence. But that fence had always been a barrier, separating her quiet world from the chaos beyond. Today, it was a barrier between her and the stray pit bull that had been wandering the neighborhood. The dog stood there now, motionless, its amber eyes fixed on her. "Emma, don't you dare touch that gate." Her mother's sharp voice came from the kitchen window. But Emma didn't move away. 11 years old and already carrying a world of loneliness on her small shoulders, she saw something in the dog, a reflection of her own isolation. The pit bull's coat was dirty, matted with mud, and crisscrossed with scars. Yet, despite its intimidating appearance, its posture was calm. It wasn't snarling, wasn't barking. It simply waited, as though it understood that this moment wasn't about fear but trust. Her fingers hovered over the rusty latch. "You're not like they say, are you?" Emma whispered, her voice soft but steady. She knew she was breaking the rules. She knew the stories about stray dogs, especially ones that looked like this, powerful, dangerous, unpredictable. But Emma didn't care. She was tired of rules that kept her caged, tired of a world that never seemed to see her. She took a deep breath and opened the gate. The creak of the metal made her flinch, but the dog didn't move aggressively. Instead, it took a step forward, tail wagging tentatively, as though it wasn't sure how to respond. Emma knelt down, extending a trembling hand. From the window, her mother let out a gasp. You know. But Emma wasn't listening. In the stillness of that moment, she and the dog shared something unspoken, a connection neither of them had ever felt before. The dog lowered its head, sniffed her hand, and then did something that would shock not only her family but the entire neighborhood. The dog leaned forward, its wet nose brushing Emma's palm. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, but the pit bull didn't snap or growl. Instead, it licked her hand, tentatively, as if testing her kindness. Emma felt a rush of relief and a strange warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. From the kitchen window, her mother's face was pale, her hands gripping the windowsill. "Emma, get inside right now," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. But Emma stayed where she was, her eyes locked on the dog's. "He's not dangerous, Mom," she called back. "He's just scared." The pit bull sat down, its tail wagging slightly now, its amber eyes softening. Emma reached out slowly, her small hand brushing against its coarse fur. The dog didn't flinch. "You're okay," she murmured. "I won't hurt you." She had no idea where the courage came from, but in that moment, she felt unshakable. Her mother burst out of the back door, panic in her every step. "Emma, get away from it. You don't know what that dog's capable of," she cried, her voice shrill with worry. But Emma shook her head, her own voice calm. "He's not going to hurt me, Mom." She pointed to the dog, which was now lying on its belly, its head resting on its paws, a picture of submission. Emma's mother stopped in her tracks, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. The neighbors, who had gathered at their own fences to watch, murmured in disbelief. No one had dared approach the stray, convinced it was dangerous. But here it was, calm and gentle under the hand of a little girl who saw something no one else could. The pit bull followed Emma into the yard, his steps careful as though afraid of breaking her trust. She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers through his matted fur. "You need a name," she said softly. For a moment, she considered calling him something fierce, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw something different, something tender. "Lucky," she decided. "Because you're lucky to be here, and I'm lucky to have met you." Lucky's tail thumped against the ground, his amber eyes shining with what Emma swore looked like gratitude. Her mother stood frozen on the porch, torn between anger and fear, but even she couldn't deny the strange bond forming between her daughter and the stray. "Emma, we can't keep him," her mother finally said, her voice quieter now but firm. "He could be dangerous or sick. He doesn't belong here." Emma stood, her small frame resolute. "He's not dangerous, and he does belong here, with me." It wasn't just defiance in her voice, it was conviction, a strength her mother rarely saw. Her mother sighed, glancing at the neighbors, who were still watching intently. "At least let me call animal control," she pleaded. "They can check if he's got an owner." Emma shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "They'll take him away. And if no one claims him, they'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of Lucky in a cold, lonely cage was unbearable. Emma's mother hesitated, seeing the desperation in her daughter's face. "All right," she said reluctantly, "he can stay, just for tonight. But we'll figure something out tomorrow?" Emma nodded, relief washing over her. She turned back to Lucky, who wagged his tail as though he understood. "It's just you and me now," she whispered to him, unaware of the secrets Lucky carried and the danger they would soon face together. That night, Emma laid an old blanket on the porch for Lucky. The pit bull circled it a few times before settling down with a satisfied sigh. Emma sat beside him, stroking his fur in the warm glow of the porch light. "You'll be safe here," she whispered. Lucky wagged his tail in response, his trust in her growing with every moment. Inside, Emma's mother paced the kitchen. "This is insane, Peter," she said into the phone. Emma could hear her mother's voice through the open window. "She just brought it in like some lost kitten. What if it attacks her?" There was a long pause before she continued. No one around here owns it. I'm sure it's a stray." Emma frowned. She didn't want her mother calling animal control. Lucky wasn't just some stray, he was hers now. "Don't listen to her," she whispered, leaning closer to Lucky. "We'll prove to her you're a good dog." Lucky's ears twitched as if he understood her promise. As the moon climbed higher, the quiet of the night was broken by a sound, a faint rustling near the fence. Lucky's head shot up, his ears perked and his body tense. Emma followed his gaze but saw nothing in the shadows. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. Lucky let out a soft growl, his body stiff as he stared into the dark. Emma stood, peering toward the fence. "Probably just a raccoon," she said, trying to sound confident. But something about Lucky's alertness unsettled her. He didn't seem like a dog easily spooked. She decided to trust him and step back. "Come on, boy," she said, motioning toward the door. Lucky hesitated, his eyes lingering on the shadows, before following her inside. Whatever was out there could wait, at least for now. Emma woke early the next morning to the sound of Lucky scratching softly at the door. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the backyard in hues of orange and gold. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her mother, and opened the door. Lucky trotted out, his nose immediately to the ground, sniffing the grass with purpose. "What is it, boy?" Emma asked, stepping onto the porch. Lucky moved toward the fence, his tail stiff and his body alert. As Emma followed, she noticed something strange, faint marks in the dirt near the fence line. They were too large to be from a raccoon or stray cat, and their shape wasn't quite human either. Her stomach tightened with unease. Lucky let out a low growl, his amber eyes scanning the edge of the yard. Emma knelt beside the tracks, her fingers brushing the soil. They were fresh. Someone, or something, had been there during the night. She glanced at Lucky, whose posture was still tense. "You heard it, didn't you?" she whispered. He wagged his tail slightly as if to confirm. Her mother's voice startled her. "Emma, what are you doing out here so early?" Emma turned to see her mother standing on the porch, her arms crossed. "Lucky heard something last night," Emma explained, pointing to the tracks. Her mother frowned, stepping closer. "What are those?" she muttered, leaning down to inspect the marks. "Probably just a stray dog," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Emma wasn't convinced either. Something about the tracks felt wrong, but she didn't want to scare her mother or herself. "Maybe," she said quietly. But as she looked at Lucky, who hadn't taken his eyes off the fence, she knew this wasn't the end of it. Something had been watching them, and it wasn't gone yet. The day passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the tracks near the fence. She watched Lucky closely, hoping for clues, but he seemed content to lie by her side, soaking up the Texas sun. Yet every so often, his ears would twitch, and his gaze would dart toward the fence, as if he could sense something no one else could. That night, Emma convinced her mother to let Lucky sleep inside. "Just this once," her mother said reluctantly, setting an old towel near Emma's bed for him. Lucky settled down easily, his presence a comfort Emma hadn't realized she needed. She fell asleep to the sound of his steady breathing, her hand resting lightly on his back. But deep in the night, Emma woke to a noise, a faint, shuffling sound outside her window. She sat up, her heart pounding. Lucky was already awake, his ears erect and his body rigid. He stared at the window, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What is it?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Lucky didn't move, his gaze locked on the dark glass. Summoning her courage, Emma tiptoed to the window and peeked through the curtains. At first, she saw nothing but the faint outline of the yard. Then her breath caught. A shadow moved near the fence, slow and deliberate. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. They were tall, their figure indistinct in the moonlight, but their movements were purposeful. Emma's heart raced as she backed away from the window. Lucky growled louder, his eyes never leaving the glass. "Mom," Emma hissed, rushing to her door. She didn't know who or what was out there, but one thing was certain: whoever it was, they didn't belong. Emma woke to the sound of Lucky's low growl, a warning deep in his chest. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw the moonlight spilling through the window. Lucky's eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond, his body tense. Without a word, Emma climbed out of bed, trying not to wake her mother, who was still asleep on the other side of the room. She crouched next to Lucky, whispering, "What is it, boy?" The soft sound of shuffling footsteps reached her ears, just outside the window. The hair on the back of Emma's neck stood up. She moved quietly toward the window and peeked through the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadowy figure was moving slowly along the fence, their tall, lanky frame barely visible in the darkness. They didn't seem to notice Emma, but Lucky sure did. He growled louder now, his ears pricked, staring at the window with intensity. "Mom," Emma whispered, shaking her mother awake. "There's someone outside." Her mother's eyes widened, but before she could respond, the stranger stopped. They turned their heads slowly toward the house, as if sensing they were being watched. Emma froze, holding her breath. The figure's gaze lingered for a moment, then they swiftly disappeared into the darkness beyond the fence. Her mother's voice cracked as she grabbed her phone. "Stay here. I'll call the police," she said. Emma nodded, her heart racing as she held onto Lucky's collar. "Who was that?" she whispered. Lucky didn't respond, but his gaze never wavered from the fence. The sense of unease in the air was thick. Whoever this person was, they weren't just passing through. The police arrived soon after, searching the yard and the area around the house. They found nothing, no sign of the stranger or any other evidence, except for the faint tracks near the fence. "Looks like a trespasser," one officer said, but his voice lacked confidence. As they left, Emma's mother locked every door, and Emma remained on edge. Lucky's growls had subsided, but Emma knew something was still lurking nearby. The following morning, Emma's mother was still on the phone with the police, her voice tense. Yes, we'll be careful. But if they come back, her words trailed off. Emma could see the worry etched in her mother's face. The police had promised extra patrols, but Emma could sense that no one had the answers they were looking for. She stared at Lucky, who lay at her feet, looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. Emma had never been so aware of how vulnerable their small house felt. It wasn't just the stranger anymore. It was the sense of something lurking in the shadows, something Emma couldn't quite put into words. She decided to check the fence again, hoping to find something that would explain what had happened. Lucky followed her closely, his eyes scanning the yard. They reached the spot where Emma had seen the strange tracks the night before. The dirt was disturbed again, but this time, there was something else, something small caught on the fence. Emma knelt down and reached for it. It was a piece of dark green fabric, torn at the edges. She held it up, her mind racing. "Who was here?" she muttered, showing it to Lucky. He growled softly, his teeth bared. Emma turned back toward the house, clutching the fabric tightly. She could feel her heart racing, but she didn't want to alarm her mother. The fabric was a clue, but it didn't tell her anything concrete. She knew, deep down, that whoever had been watching them hadn't gone far. Someone, was still out there. But for now, all she could do was keep quiet and wait. Later that night, Emma lay awake, the fabric tucked safely under her pillow. Lucky lay beside her, his breathing steady, but his eyes always alert. Emma whispered to him, "We'll figure this out, won't we, Lucky?" His tail thumped softly in response, a quiet promise in the dark. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The next morning, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt thick, like the calm before a storm. She and Lucky spent most of the day in the backyard, the dog's every move a silent warning. Emma's mother had gone to work, but Emma had stayed behind, knowing she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced at the old fence every few minutes, certain that something, was lurking just beyond the wood. At dusk, just as the sky began to turn purple, Lucky's behavior changed. He began pacing near the back door, his eyes scanning the yard, his body tense. Emma frowned. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, her heart beginning to race. Lucky growled low and deep, and then barked sharply, sharp, insistent, as if he was trying to warn her of something approaching. Emma opened the door just a crack, peering outside. The yard was empty, but the unease that had been building in her chest only grew. She stepped out into the cool evening air, her pulse quickening. The sun had nearly set, and the shadows around the fence grew longer, darker. It was then that she saw it, movement in the distance, just beyond the yard, near the tree line. She couldn't make out the figure at first, but it was unmistakably there. A tall silhouette, walking slowly toward the house. Emma's heart skipped a beat. It was the same figure from before, the stranger. Lucky's growl intensified, but Emma hesitated. She couldn't just stand there. She needed to do something, anything, to protect her home. "Mom!" Emma shouted, her voice filled with panic. Her mother came running out of the house, but by the time she reached Emma's side, the figure had disappeared. It was as though they'd melted into the shadows. Emma's legs shook, and her mother immediately checked the doors and windows. "Stay inside, both of you," she said, her voice tight with fear. Emma didn't need to be told twice. She and Lucky retreated into the house, the feeling of dread lingering in the air. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The shadowy figure she had seen earlier still haunted her thoughts. Lucky lay at her feet, but even he seemed restless. His eyes darted to the door, ears perked, and every so often he would growl softly, as if sensing something Emma couldn't. She wondered if he too could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken danger. Her mother was already asleep, but Emma knew something was wrong. The stranger hadn't just appeared in their yard for no reason. There had to be more to this, more than just a random trespasser. The pieces of the puzzle started to click into place. The tracks, the fabric, the figure, it all pointed to something darker than she could have imagined. Someone knew they were here and they weren't going away. Then, a sound broke through the silence of the night. A faint knocking. Not at the door, but at the window. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She sat up slowly, her eyes wide. Lucky's growl was louder now, more urgent. He was alert, his hackles raised. The knock came again, this time accompanied by a voice, low and familiar. "Emma." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but Emma recognized it immediately. It was her father's voice, the one she hadn't heard in over a year. "Emma, it's me." Emma's heart slammed against her chest, and she rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain. Standing there, just beyond the glass, was the figure. The same stranger. But it wasn't a stranger at all. It was her father, older, worn, but unmistakably him. Emma's knees gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her mind reeling. The man she thought she had lost forever was standing outside her window, but his return was anything but a reunion. As her mother rushed into the room, Emma stared at the man outside, realization dawning. The danger was never the stranger. The danger was him.